Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Rīga Conference is online today here on November 20th at the Latvian National Library. Last year it was full house. Now we have online viewers all across Europe and even furthermore away. I am very pleased to say a few words at the opening session of this Rīga Conference 2020. My name is Toms Baumanis. I am representing Latvian Transatlantic Organization, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. And I was lucky to chair this organization for almost 20 years. A lot of us founded with objective to promote Latvia's NATO membership, promote awareness about transatlantic values, and educate society about international and security policy affairs. 20 years ago, we haven't thought about things like today, about pandemic taking over the world, about Belarus being infected by democracy, about fake news infecting people's minds, rather China than Russia, shaping multipolar world, and other things among them like NATO relevance across the Atlantic is questioned. That would never come in our mind. I think there is much more turmoil and unknown ahead of us, so venues like Rīga Conference, exchange of views, using social media to promote your beliefs and values is very important for all of us. So I'm very happy that we were able to put together this conference this year despite of all difficulties. And with this brief intro, let me present our first panel. And the panel will be moderated by our most famous investigative journalist, Raudseps, who is also board chairman of another media. And in the first panel, we'll have Prime Minister talking to all of us. Pauls, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Toms, for that very generous introduction. I see myself more as a commentator than an investigative journalist, but fine if you think I look into things as well. I hope that's true. As Toms said, I'll be moderating this opening session. It's called Snapshot For The Future. Now, that's a title that leaves a lot of space for our speakers to decide what they want to talk about, but it is very precise in defining what we expect from them. All three of our speakers are among the decision makers who will be shaping what the future looks like. And what we hope to hear from them is a description, a snapshot, if you will, of where we are today and what is the future they foresee and are working towards. In these extremely uncertain times, having a clear vision becomes more important than ever. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our opening speaker, the Prime Minister of Latvia, Krišjānis Kariņš. Please, Mr. Kariņš.
Thank you very much, Pauls. Good morning to everybody. It is a very different world that we live in today. Just think back to the last Rīga Conference. We were here in the National Library. There was a large auditorium full of people, lots of lively discussion. Today, I'm addressing a camera to attendees who are kilometers or maybe thousands of kilometers away from one another. The COVID-19 pandemic really has wreaked havoc on us. It's wreaked havoc on our healthcare systems. It's wreaked havoc on our economies. And it's wreaked havoc and brought tremendous change in our behavior. Some of that will be maybe beneficial in the longer term, so distance working, less commuting, better for the environment, more use of technology. But other effects are still to be measured, such as what will be the long-term effects on school children, many of whom are having to go prolonged periods of education, not in a classroom setting, but also remotely, what that has to do with social development. These are all things to be seen. COVID-19 has also greatly exacerbated, I believe, all of the geopolitical challenges that we had anyway prior to it. And of course, during this time, we have some new challenges that have outgrown from the existing ones. So Turkey, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Libya, and recently the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh is a difficulty. China, of course, the long-standing difficulties with Taiwan, the Xinjiang, the Muslim-speaking area, the Muslim religion area, and the obvious oppressions there, the crackdown in Hong Kong, and seemingly the effective end of one country, two systems. These are huge challenges, not to speak of the trade difficulties that both the US and the EU are having with China. And then, of course, there's Russia. There's the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The occupation of Crimea has not, of course, ended. The ongoing war in the Donbass is ongoing. The conflict or the occupied areas in Georgia are still occupied. And then we have Belarus, where, again, Russia is siding not with people who wish for free and democratic leadership, but with the leader who, in our view, simply has overstepped all bounds of anything resembling free and fair elections. And then, of course, we have our old friend, disinformation, fake news, the fragmentation of information, and with that, the fragmentation of society. So our challenges with the COVID-19 pandemic have only grown. But there is some good light in this story as well, and that is our neighbor Belarus. And what we see is that even today, as democracies around the world have been losing their footing, people still yearn for democracy. So in Belarus, the people have risen up against a president who refuses to accept that the elections were greatly rigged, that they were neither free nor fair, and they are simply demanding free and fair elections because they want to live in a stable, independent, and democratic Belarus. So the yearning inside people's hearts has not changed. The outward circumstances and the ability to live that has. So then the question is, where do we go from here? The situation is not one to be happy about on the whole in the world, but what should we do about it? In my view, it's very clear what needs to be done. Like-minded democracies need to work more closely together to face up to all of the challenges that we have. And there's a very clear, it's like a triangle that needs to pull itself closer together. That is the EU on the one side, the US on the other side, and the NATO military alliance, which of course covers both, or at least partially covers the EU as a third. We need, as Europe, to improve EU-US relations. And of course, the recent elections in the US are, I believe, a glimmer of hope that we could have a basis for renewing and improving US-EU ties, which are crucial to both of our economies, to both of our interests. Because the EU and the US, when combined, are a very formidable force in the world, not only militarily, but also economically. Because I think there is a real question, who will set the rules of trade and commerce in the future? It seems to no longer be a given that US dominance will prevail in the long run. Will it be China? Will it be other areas of the world? Or will it be the US and the EU? And I'm convinced that it needs to be the US and the EU. Now, on the EU side, we need to strengthen ourselves as well. So there are some EU leaders, some good friends and colleagues of mine who argue the same, but sometimes there's this feeling that I can go it alone. And sometimes some relatively large EU countries have tried to go it alone, but it's just not enough. What we need is to work as a bloc, because when we as a bloc stick together, we have and we can have a real say in the world, in the geopolitical world, as it is now is often called. When you combine the market force of over 400 million people, combined with the potential military force, that is a formidable partner indeed. And when I speak of a stronger EU, I do not mean an EU detached from NATO, but an EU as a stronger partner of NATO. So we can do a lot more also militarily, coordinating, looking at common purchases, other ways to pool resources to make ourselves stronger as a NATO partner. And I think this is cannot be stressed enough. A strong EU does not, militarily, does not in any way, in my view, juxtapose a strong NATO. On the other, just the opposite, it would enhance a strong NATO by being a strong partner in and of itself. And finally, it's difficult, as the Prime Minister of Latvia, not to focus a little bit on Russia, our neighbor. Of course, Latvia wants to have good relations with our neighbor. Every country wants to have good relations with their neighbor, just as every person, I believe, wants to have good relations with their direct neighbors. The question is, it usually takes at least two to have a good relationship. It's not enough to have one to have a good relationship. And what we are seeing with Russia is that they are showing no inclination of change right now. They're showing no inclination of change in their attitude towards the events in Ukraine. They're showing no indication of change to their attitude to the events happening in Georgia. Their attitude towards the Nagorno-Karabakh military conflict now is one of, how should we say, a kind of an ownership interest in that region. They are not showing any indication of really wanting to change. And when we look at Belarus, again, the Russian leadership is not at all siding with the people and demanding free and fair elections, but the government is siding with the current regime in Belarus, actually as opposed to the people. So Russia is and remains a great big problem. How to deal with that is, again, not on a bilateral basis, but on a multilateral basis. The EU and the US and the NATO together. The EU, the US and NATO are a strong and formidable partner that can stand up to China, that can stand up to Russia, that can stand up to injustice anywhere in the world, that can further our combined and shared values, which cannot be stated enough: freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. For us and our way of life, these are now a given. For the people in Belarus, this is something that they yearn for. And for the Belarusian people, I can say that we stand with them. We insist on free and fair elections in our neighboring country. And we hope that Belarus would be a stable, free, independent, and democratic country with, of course, good relations with its neighbor Russia, good relations with its neighbors in the EU. But to attain this, those of us that think together need to stick together, need to work together, and need to put aside any differences, because the differences that we may have are nothing compared to the differences that we have with other systems. And to face up to these challenges, we need to unite. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You pointed to NATO as being a key element in this alliance of democracies, and so it is only natural that our next speaker is Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, who is joining us via video link. Please, Mr. Stoltenberg.
Thank you so much, Paul, and many thanks to you, Prime Minister Kariņš. It is always a pleasure to speak in Latvia. The Rīga Conference remains an important meeting point for the strategic community. And in the Baltic region, all NATO allies stand shoulder to shoulder. Allied jets keep your skies safe. Allied ships keep the Baltic Sea secure, and NATO's multinational battle groups prevent conflict and preserve peace. NATO keeps all allies safe, in the air, on land, at sea, in cyberspace, and in space. And as you all know, Latvia makes an important contribution to our collective defense. Your forces train Afghan troops to fight terrorism and help maintain stability in Kosovo. Latvia leads by example on defense investment, spending 2% of GDP on defense. And of course, you host NATO's Canadian-led battle group in Adasi. Troops from 10 allies serve alongside Latvian forces. Soldiers from North America and Europe serving together to keep our alliance safe. All of this demonstrates the strength of the transatlantic bond, every day through concrete action. Across the alliance, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed our lives, how we live, how we work, how we relate to each other, even how we perceive threats to our security. NATO's main responsibility is to make sure that this health crisis does not become a security crisis. Therefore, we have done what is necessary to keep our forces safe, to maintain our operational readiness and sustain our missions and operations from the Baltic Sea to Afghanistan. And we continue to deliver a credible deterrence and defense for our alliance. Beyond that, we have strengthened civilian efforts to tackle the coronavirus. During the first wave of the pandemics, hundreds of thousands of allied troops supported civilian efforts. Hundreds of flights delivered critical supplies around the world, and almost 100 field hospitals treated many thousands of patients. As we all know, we have now entered the second wave. Just in the last weeks, we have distributed hundreds of extra ventilators to our allies, Albania, the Czech Republic, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. NATO and allies are ready to provide further assistance quickly and efficiently. But there are some things the coronavirus has not changed. It has not changed allies' dedication to each other. It has not changed our commitment to our values. It has not changed our resolve to defend and protect our people. And unfortunately, the pandemic has not changed the fact that we still face many other challenges. Russia's aggressive acts and military activities continue unabated. For many years, we have seen a disturbing pattern of Russian behavior. Its illegal annexation of Crimea and destabilization of eastern Ukraine. A massive military buildup on our borders. The use of a military-grade nerve agent, attempts to assassinate its opponents, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, attempts to interfere in our elections, and Russia's deployment of new nuclear-capable missiles that led to the demise of the INF Treaty. This is part of a whole suite of new Russian capabilities. And in response, NATO allies are acquiring new air and missile defense systems, including Patriot and SAM-T batteries. We are strengthening our advanced conventional capabilities, investing in new platforms, including fifth-generation fighter aircraft, adapting our intelligence and exercises, and keeping our nuclear deterrent safe, secure, and effective. At the same time, Russia remains our biggest neighbor. It is not going anywhere. That is why we maintain dialogue with Russia, to avoid incidents, accidents, and miscalculations, and because we are committed to effective arms control. But know one thing, NATO and all NATO allies will do whatever is necessary to keep all our countries safe. Everything NATO does is defensive, including our presence here in the Baltic region. So when the leadership in Belarus tries to use NATO as a pretext for cracking down on its own people, it is completely unjustified and absolutely wrong. Our message is that only the people of Belarus should decide the future of Belarus. NATO also faces many other challenges. China is asserting its economic, diplomatic, and military weight. New technologies such as artificial intelligence and autonomous systems are changing the nature of conflict. Conflict which is fought in new domains like cyber and also in space. And terrorist attacks continue. In the recent weeks, we have seen barbaric attacks in France, in Austria, as well as in Afghanistan. NATO must be able to respond to all these challenges. We must always look forward to prepare for tomorrow's challenges, just as we rise to meet today's. This is why I have launched the NATO 2030 initiative. NATO 2030 has 3 objectives. First, it is about staying strong militarily. In a challenging security environment, we need to continue to invest in our deterrence and defense. Not only in tanks and bullets, but also in cyber and other new capabilities. Second, we must make NATO a stronger political alliance. It is not news that allies sometimes have their differences, but NATO is the only place where North America and Europe meet every day. So it is the best place to sit down, remember what unites us, and solve our differences together. And third, NATO needs a more global approach. Not because we want to be a global alliance, but because so many of the challenges we face are global. Like terrorism, cyber threats, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and of course, the rise of China. So we need to work ever more closely with our partners and with other organizations like the United Nations and the European Union to protect our values and way of life and to defend the global rules-based order. None of our countries, even the biggest ones, can deal with the challenges we now face alone. We need to work together to find common solutions. As part of NATO 2030, I'm seeking a wide range of views from experts, from academia, and from the civil society. All of this will feed into my recommendations to NATO leaders when they meet next year. As part of this, I also believe it is now time for us to develop a new strategic concept for NATO. An updated blueprint for how NATO can adapt and respond to the very challenging strategic environment we face today. So, ladies and gentlemen, NATO is the most successful alliance in history. Our success is based on our values, freedom, democracy, the rule of law, and on the unbreakable bond between our countries, between Europe and North America. It is only by remaining united, investing in our defense, and looking to the future that we will maintain the peace, prosperity we have enjoyed for so many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stoltenberg. We move now to the question and answer part of our session, a chance for our participants to address their questions to Mr. Stoltenberg and Mr. Kariņš. You can do that by clicking on the blue button in the bottom right-hand corner of your Rīga Conference screen and writing your question, which I will then address to either Mr. Kariņš or Mr. Stoltenberg, or to both of them. But to get the ball rolling, we have 2 participants who already lined up who will address their questions personally via video link. The first question is from Renāte Grudule, a student at of International Relations at Rīga Stradiņa Universitāte. Please, Renāte, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Your Excellencies. As Paul's mentioned, my name is Renāte Grudule, and I'm a student of International Relations in Rīga Stradiņa University. My question is addressed to Secretary General. Could you elaborate on the role of disinformation and social media on youth radicalization? Is NATO considering to expand its scope towards defensive tactics in the new age global war on terror? We have recently seen dramatic developments in this area in NATO member states. How far does the situation need to go before there are NATO repercussions? Thank you.
We are taking disinformation very seriously because we see more and more disinformation. We see it from non-government organizations, from terrorist organizations, and from state organizations. And of course, we need to respond. And I think that the best response is, of course, to make sure that facts, the truth is available, because I strongly believe that in the long run, the truth will prevail. So we are providing facts, we are helping allies to push back, and we actually are in regular updating a homepage at NATO where we actually counter a lot of the disinformation we see out there, especially in cyberspace on social media. We also help to increase the awareness in different capitals about the seriousness of disinformation in different forms. And of course, this is also partly linked to what we do in cyberspace and protecting our networks. But in the long run, I actually believe that the most important thing we can do to counter disinformation is to make sure that we have a free and independent press, that we have journalists who are asking the difficult questions, who are checking their sources, who are not victims for disinformation campaigns. So the whole idea of having strong democratic institutions, having a strong, independent, free press, I think is actually the best way of making us as little vulnerable as possible for disinformation. And that's perhaps the best bulwark against disinformation.
Thank you, Mr. Stoltenberg. The second question will be from Anita Pizela. She is a lieutenant colonel in the Latvian National Armed Forces. Lieutenant Colonel.
Good morning, sir. I would like to address my question to Mr. Stoltenberg. And of course, at first, I would like to say that we appreciate all NATO efforts to secure our country. And as I am connected very much to military exercises, and we all know that combat readiness of NATO troops is very crucial. And it is mostly maintained through the exercises and collective training. And in this slide, when a lot of exercises are downsized or even some of them are cancelled, I have a question. How the current situation affects NATO troops' collective training and their combat readiness? And the second part of the question is, in your opinion, what should be done in the future? What lessons we have learned from this situation? Thank you.
First of all, I totally agree that readiness is key, and therefore we have been extremely focused on how to increase the readiness of our forces. The NATO forces and, of course, general introduce a culture of readiness into our different allies and their forces. When it comes to Latvia and the Baltic region, I think we have to understand that just the fact that we now have multinational combat-ready NATO troops in Latvia has significantly increased the readiness. I remember well when we prepared for the NATO summit in Warsaw in 2016 that it was not obvious that all NATO allies are going to agree on a decision to deploy 4 battalions in Poland and the 3 Baltic countries of combat-ready troops. That's what we have now, and that's a huge improvement of readiness, the fact that we have these troops there every day. And also the fact that they are multinational demonstrates that NATO is there working together with the host nation, Latvia, working together with you. I think that's a very strong demonstration of readiness. Then, of course, we need exercises, and therefore we have made sure that we are able to uphold our operational readiness throughout the pandemic, but to minimize the risk for the spread of the virus, for actually a situation where that could undermine the strength of our forces. We have been forced to implement some measures, meaning adapting, scaling down some of the exercises. If this continues, so of course we need to look into how we can scale up and do more exercises with the pandemic. But of course, the main goal for all of us is that we, at some stage, within a not too distant future, are able to find a vaccine, are able to deal with the pandemic, so we can return to more normal behavior and more normal exercise patterns. But I think my main message is that yes, we have adapted some exercises, but overall, NATO has been able to maintain operational readiness. We have been able to maintain our missions operations, the battle groups in the Baltic countries, the air policing, our maritime patrols. So we are there operating as a strong alliance in the midst of the pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Stoltenberg. I see the questions are coming in, but I'm going to take advantage of my position as the moderator to ask a question that's been troubling me in the last weeks. We see military conflict breaking out in Nagorno-Karabakh. Over the last years, Ukraine, Libya, Syria, the number of military conflicts on the European perimeter are growing. And I wanted to ask you, do you see the COVID pandemic as something that increases the risk of military conflict, or as something that decreases it, or are things pretty much staying the same? And that's a question to both of you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I don't see in any way that it would decrease conflict, but what it does is it increases stress in any society. It's hard to say. For example, Nagorno-Karabakh, I'm unaware that this is a direct result of the pandemic. And how much the pandemic actually affected Azeri and Armenian thinking in this may be little to none. But what's clear is that, at least in our societies, in the Western societies, it is causing people to, it's another fault line. So now there's the question, do you believe that it's a conspiracy, or do you believe it's a disease? Do you believe that there are measures that can be taken against it, so wearing masks or not wearing masks? And these all become politicized as another visible way to drive societies apart. At the same time, as the healthcare system is under stress, the economy is under stress, and the educational system is under stress. So it certainly is affecting our societies, the democratic societies. That's very clear. Whether it's stoking more conflict is unclear, but it certainly is not helping. So I think it only increases our own challenges, not the least of which is unity within our societies, because that's my entire premise and argument, is that we in the West need to be unified because the difficulties are arising by themselves. And if we are disunited, that is our weakness and their strength. So the pandemic is actually hampering unity because it's providing yet another fault line.
Thank you. Mr. Stoltenberg, from NATO headquarters, is COVID increasing the risks of military conflict?
At least the pandemic is putting heavy pressure on our societies, and not only on NATO allies, but societies and countries all over the world. And of course, that can, at some stage, also increase the risk for potential conflicts. But I will not speculate about too much about the link between the pandemic and potential crisis risks in the future. What I will say is actually the same as the Prime Minister, that regardless of how much we believe there is a risk or a link between pandemic and potential risks in the future, we need to be prepared. It has proven over the decades extremely hard to predict what will be the next crisis. Is it Ukraine, or is it 9/11, or is it a pandemic, or is it whatever it is? The thing is that we need to be prepared for the unforeseen. So instead of being so focused on trying to predict the next crisis, which has proven extremely difficult, we need to be always prepared for surprises, for crisis, and then as long as we stand together, as long as we have a strong alliance, as long as we stand up for the principle of one for all and all for one, then we are partly able to reduce the risk for any threats and challenges and crises, because any potential adversary knows that we are together, we defend each other. And second, if there is a threat, if there is a challenge to NATO allies, we are much more able to deal with it as long as we stand together. And the pandemic demonstrates that, because NATO allies have provided significant help to each other, and we have seen how the military across the alliance have been critical and extremely helpful in supporting the civilian efforts to cope with the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. A question has come in from our audience for Prime Minister Kariņš. States closed their borders and blocked the export of vital medical inventory during the COVID. How can we prevent similar reflexes if security threats arise?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very pertinent question. But what we've seen, at least in Europe, so in the first, let's call it a wave in the spring, the quick reflex was to close borders to stop the virus, and it had the knock-on negative effect of actually impeding flows of goods. And no one intended that, but we had 40-hour longer lines on many member state borders, which included not only food, but also vital medical supply chains. But what we are seeing now in the second wave is that despite the numbers being actually far worse than in the first wave, we are not closing our borders because also as heads of state and government, we've spoken a lot about this, that it's vital to keep our borders open. That's not going to solve the issue, and to cooperate with one another. So on some level, we have learned from, you could say it's a mistake, or it's something that hadn't been thought about before. But if we were to need at any point to restrict the movement of people, say for a pandemic or this pandemic, it is vital that we keep always the supply routes open. And the difficulty is that on the border controls are not generally set for people and goods being completely separated, because the drivers of those goods are also people, so everyone is being checked.
One thing is borders, but I think what the question is also asking is about medical supplies. Some states had large reserves that they didn't need at the moment, and other states had an emergency, but there was a lack of willingness to share in some cases. Do you see that as a problem?
I see that as a very big problem, and I also see that this crisis has shown that even within Europe we have a lack of capability to supply ourselves. So, for example, for the personal protection equipment, the PPEs, many countries, including my own, we had to turn to China to purchase face masks and gloves and plastic coats for doctors, etc., because there simply is not enough supply capability in Europe. And I think this is a question that we need to return to. What are the vital industries that we need to make certain that they exist in Europe? I think that on the medical supply issue, probably markets will have adjusted, and companies will be investing, and maybe say with face masks, this issue now seems to be resolved. There seems to be plenty of supply also made in EU supply today. But I think we need to look ahead to what other kinds of supplies. Do we have a security in military? I think the answer there would be yes. What about in the food chain? What about in other chains? And this is not resolved, and I think it has been a very big problem.
A question for Mr. Stoltenberg. Societal resilience is increasingly becoming a precondition of security. One example of that is hybrid threats that undermine solidarity in societies. How will NATO expand its scope to meet this need?
So one part of NATO 2030, this reflection on the future of NATO will also address resilience, and resilience has become more and more important for NATO. It's actually a very old topic. It's enshrined in our founding treaty, the Washington Treaty, back in 1949, but it has been not so high on our agenda over the last years. But now the importance of resilience has just increased, because we have seen so many threats and challenges, which are not what is a classical military threats, but hybrid cyber threats, and that illustrates the importance of having strong societies. We cannot have strong defense without having strong societies. And that is demonstrated by the importance of, for instance, civilian infrastructure for military operations, but also, of course, for running the civilian society as such. The majority of the movements of equipment and soldiers and so on that has to take place in the crisis will be done by civilian means of transport. And therefore we need civilian infrastructure, transport, airfields, harbors, and so on, which are functioning, which are resilient in times of crisis and the conflict. We are to deal with that. We have developed something we call baseline requirements for resilience in different strands, like telecommunications, continuation of government, health services, but also infrastructure and transportation. For instance, looking into telecommunications, 5G, to make sure that we address issues like foreign ownership, foreign control, so we have certainty that all these systems are in place, especially in times of crisis, because they are so critical to the operation of our societies in general, but of course also for any military operation.
Okay, I understand Mr. Stoltenberg has to leave us in a couple of minutes, so I'll address the next question to him as well. From the audience, can NATO retain its credibility and successfully continue its mission in light of growing tensions among certain members?
I think we have to understand that NATO is an alliance of 30 different allies from both sides of the Atlantic, with different political parties in power, with different history, different political cultures, and therefore there are differences between NATO allies. There is no way to deny that. At the same time, we have had differences before, also dating back to the Suez Crisis in 1956, or when France decided to leave the military cooperation in the 1960s in NATO, or the Iraq War in 2003. So if you look back, there have been many disagreements, differences between NATO allies. The good thing is that despite these differences, we have always been able to overcome them and to unite around our core task, our core mission, and that is to defend and protect each other. Because we all know that we are safer and stronger when we stand together than when we are apart. And I am absolutely confident that we will be able to do that also this time. But again, NATO 2030 is about how to make sure that that happens. And one of the ways to make sure that we are able to unite despite our differences is that we should actually use NATO more as a political alliance. So when there are differences, we should sit down, discuss, try to find ways forward, and at least have open and transparent discussions about the challenges where we see when there are differences between NATO allies. Just to illustrate that with one example, there are differences when it comes to the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'm, of course, concerned about the tensions and the disagreements we have seen between two highly valued NATO allies, Greece and Turkey. At the same time, we have used NATO as a platform to develop what we call deconfliction mechanisms, because with more military presence in the Eastern Med, there is a risk for incidents, for accidents, and we have to prevent that from happening, and if it happens, at least prevent it from spiraling out of control. So I welcome that Greece and Turkey have established at NATO, because they meet here at NATO every day, mechanisms to communicate, a hotline 24-hour, and using the NATO systems to at least reduce the risks for incidents and accidents, and hopefully that also can then help to pave the way for negotiations on the underlying issues, the underlying problems related to the continental shelf and so on. So the best thing would, of course, be if we can avoid differences, agree on all issues. But given the fact that we are different nations and sometimes have different positions, we need to use NATO as a platform to minimize the consequences and find a way forward despite our differences. And we have done that for more than 70 years. I'm confident that we can do that also for many more decades to come.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Stoltenberg, and thank you for participating in the conference. I understand you have to leave now, but we've been happy to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
A question for Mr. Kariņš. How have the events in Belarus affected the position and the relationship between EU and NATO and Russia, especially given fears of possible intervention by Russia in Belarus?
Well, Belarus is simply, maybe one could say, laid more bare the general differences. So on the EU side, the instinct and the immediate instinct is to side with people who want free and fair elections. There was no long think about it. It was very clear. It was not necessarily candidate-based, but it was will of the people-based. And from the Kremlin side, from the Russian side, we see that the allegiance and the thinking is completely different. It is not at all aligned with the will of the people, but of preserving a power with whom Moscow has a very warm relationship. And what's disquieting is that this is not a case, as was in Ukraine, where the people are walking with EU flags, demanding an alignment with Europe. There is not very much talk, or almost no talk, of any kind of alignment shift, simply of wanting a democratically elected leader who presumably would continue to have good relations with Russia. And so it's really laid bare the divide in our thinking. And the thinking, I think, is because of how we become leaders. We become leaders in the West because we have a democratic mandate, which every 4 years or more often comes under question and is always subject to the will of the people at any given time. Where, of course, in Russia, Putin has been prime minister, president since 2000. So that's 20 years, and according to the constitutional changes, it looks like it will be another roughly that many years, if not more, which is a fundamental difference. It is, and Belarus very clearly symbolizes you can see the will of the people versus the will of others to govern over them, not to govern through them. And that's it simply is, it makes it very clear where everyone stands.
What more could Europe and Latvia do to help the people of Belarus in their democratic aspirations? We've instituted sanctions. Is there anything else we can do?
Now the democratic leadership is asking for more sanctions, economic sanctions, to come in as well. That is, of course, always something to consider. But I think what's important is that the EU and NATO, as a combined bloc, also puts more pressure on Russia, because Russia undoubtedly has influence in the area as well. And that's, I mean, this is the difficulty, I think, that all democratic societies face, is how do you gain influence without the ruffian method of simply moving in tanks and soldiers. So that's what the ruffians do. That's what Lukashenko is doing. He's taking his security forces and physically beating his own people, where the people, and this is what's so surprising and completely admirable, they have been for months resisting peacefully, submitting to being arrested. Just the other day, a young man was beaten to death for apparently objecting to the security forces taking down the white, red, white Belarusian nationalist flag. What do democratic societies do? We are in the business of boycotts, we are in the business of sanctions, but we're not in the business of a direct intervention, because we have a belief and an understanding that war is a very bad option and brings devastation and immense misery. But when one is already using force, it's the other side. And I think that, again, the influence that one would need would be to influence more on Russia. And regarding Russia, a sanction which I think would be very effective is the Nord Stream sanction.
Okay. I see there's some questions left, but actually we have to start moving towards the conclusion of this session. Unfortunately, I'm sorry about that. Very good questions on the screen, but we have a pre-recorded address by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and that will conclude the session. So please, the video.
Prime Minister dear Krišjānis, Secretary General dear Jens, ministers, generals, admirals, excellencies, distinguished guests. I am really sorry we cannot all meet in Riga today. I keep many good memories from my visits to Latvia as a German defense minister, and I have always believed that security in the Baltics is a European matter that concerns all Europeans, from Riga to Rome. The Rīga Conference has become a key annual appointment for transatlantic relations. So allow me to begin with a few words on the transatlantic community. There is a shared transatlantic credo built on the 4 freedoms outlined beautifully by President Roosevelt during World War II. Freedom of speech and worship, freedom from need and from fear. And this is who we are. This is why we feel we are part of a transatlantic community, beyond politics and administrations, a community of people, a community of shared values. And that was, of course, still true regardless of the outcome of the US elections last week. But like most of the world, I watched the elections intently. And I want to again warmly congratulate President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. I very much appreciate the kind words they have found, both for Europe. We can assume that the tone in the White House will change. And we will again be able to address daily concerns and issues. But what we should not expect is to turn back time or to go back to a world of before. The United States have changed, Europe has changed, the world has changed. And yes, wounds can be healed, but some shifts in priorities and perceptions on both sides of the Atlantic run much deeper than one politician or one administration. Of course, our alliance is based on shared values and history. It is based on a common belief in working together to build a stronger, more peaceful, and more prosperous world. And these goals will always endure. But I believe it is now time for a new transatlantic agenda fit for today's world. And I believe it is Europe who should take the initiative. We look very much forward to work with the new administration on areas that can strengthen our bilateral and multilateral partnerships. And this should cover everything, from security to sustainability, from tech regulation to trade, from leveling the global economic playing field to strengthening global institutions. These are not only EU-US issues, and our alliance is not just about us, but a close and trustful cooperation between the US and Europe must be the backbone of a new global alliance. It is about working with emerging powers and like-minded partners around the globe, from Africa to Latin America, from Australia to democratic Asia, and far beyond. It is about working in our common interest for the common good. Europe has a lot to contribute to such a close and flourishing partnership. Its economic strength, its leadership in areas such as data protection and green technologies, or its diverse international relations and diplomatic networks. But Europe also needs to develop more strength in some areas to improve the transatlantic cooperation, and certainly in the area of security. For years, I have been a strong advocate of strengthening the European pillar of NATO. The alliance had to change and to modernize. NATO has done an excellent job in fulfilling its mission of collective defense. New countries have joined. The threats we face have changed. And the burden sharing within the alliance is also changing. Europe started to step up We're now investing together as Europeans in capabilities that we currently lack, and this will strengthen NATO as a whole. We have invested in military mobility within Europe. We have invested in our cyber capabilities and in our response to hybrid threats. And Europe must continue to make good use of the new tools that we created in recent years, such as the permanent structured cooperation on defense and the wide cooperation established between the European Union and NATO. The EU member states, which are also members of NATO, are well aware of their remaining shortcomings and must continue to work to overcome them. Security is a common good. But the past year has also shown us once again how fragile our world is. A virus smaller than a grain of dust has managed to put international cooperation to a new test. And in the face of the crisis, some have chosen to isolate, others have tried to use a difficult situation to strike geopolitical gains. Europe has chosen to lend a helping hand. From the very outset, we organized the global response to coronavirus. We convened more than 40 countries to collectively raise over 16 billion euros for tests, treatments, and for research towards a vaccine. We helped set up COVAX, a global initiative to create the largest portfolio of vaccine candidates in the world, and we brought together 186 countries, but also NGOs, business leaders, and philanthropists, and together we are securing millions of doses of future vaccines for low-income countries. No country can achieve this alone, but together we can. And we want to invite everyone to join us. We need to pool our expertise, share our resources, and coordinate our approach to tests and treatment, to vaccines and vaccinations. And here too, I see great potential for Europe and the United States of America to work more closely together. Common positions and joint action are also urgently needed in other areas. I would like to focus in particular on the situation in our eastern neighborhood. The people of Belarus are asking for democracy. Tensions have risen once again in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the poisoning of Alexei Navalny represents yet another violation of international law by Russia's leadership. In these months, the European Union has taken clear positions on all these developments. And I believe that decisive action must follow now. So let me present two ideas for a renewed engagement by the European Union beyond our eastern borders. First, our European global human rights sanction regime. Finally, it will allow us to target those responsible for human rights violation worldwide, no matter where they occur. We have proposed a number of sanctions, from freezing assets to travel restrictions, so to maximize the impact of our measures. And second, I would like a more strategic approach to our economic cooperation. Since 2014, the European Union has mobilized over 15 billion euros to accompany Ukraine's stabilization. And thanks to our support, Ukraine is today a much stronger country. And this is what we have to offer to countries who decide to embark on a substantive reform process. And this is what we could offer to a democratic Belarus. The people of Belarus are asking for free and fair elections. They see people going to the polls in these very days in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova, and they ask for the same right. Democracy in Belarus. This is their goal, and this is what we want to support. And this is why the European heads of state and government have asked the European Commission to prepare a plan of economic support for democratic Belarus. The European Union stands ready to mobilize all its economic means to support and accompany democratic change. Europe's economic influence is immense. It is up to us to make a more strategic use of our economic clout. It is up to us to take clearer positions and to enforce them with stronger actions. I will keep working for an assertive and courageous Europe, and I know you are on our side. Thank you.